Now, the Cleveland Indians of Major League Baseball are an interesting case. They were around since before the American League, which is their league, was a major league. All the way back to when it was known as the Western League and was a minor league. We're talking the late 1800s. They've been known as the Lake Shores, I think the Bluebirds and the Blues. They were known as the Naps, named after their most famous and greatest player, who was a Hall of Fame player named Napoleon Lajoie. Not quite sure exactly how his last name's correctly pronounced in the French. They were known as the Spiders. Now, in those days, it wasn't until maybe the 1910s, actually. It wasn't until then that these professional sports teams' nicknames were truly their names. They literally were nicknames given to them by their fan base or by the media. So, for instance, the Cincinnati Red Stockings in the late 1800s were called the Red Stockings because they wore red stockings. Today, the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago White Sox, their name is spelt with an X in Sox because the newspaper editors needed to maximize the amount of space in the headline. And X was easier and kind of cutesy instead of CKS. You know, the Brooklyn Dodgers were known as the Super Bas, the Bridegrooms, the Trolley Dodgers, and the Robins, after their manager, whose last name was Robinson. And again, it wasn't till mass media really took off institutionally in the 20th century that certain nicknames were truly and fully adopted and sanctioned legally by the teams. Such is the case with the Cleveland Indians. And it was around 1914, I want to say, when in baseball there was sort of a popular craze with Native American names. The Boston Braves, who are today of Atlanta, had recently won the World Series. And the Cleveland Indians had either a contest or an appeal to their fan base as to what their new nickname should be. Their permanent nickname, I suppose, should be. And what was chosen was the name Indians. And a reason for that is because they had a popular player on their team in the late 1800s who was, in fact, a Native American. And that was Louis Sockalexis. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that name right. I have never heard it spoken. I may be pronouncing it correctly. I really don't know. But Louis Sockalexis, my impression of him is of sort of like a Bo Jackson or a Yasiel Puig, in that he had a very high ceiling in terms of ability, in terms of talent, an amazing arm, could crush the ball, had amazing speed, for instance, but did not necessarily have the ability to maintain that level on a consistent basis. which is really what separates all the greats from the good from the not so good. A lot of players in any sport, on any given play, on any given day, in any given year, can display greatness. The question is, can they do that every game, all season, every season? And there are some players in whatever sport who may not even have as high a ceiling in terms of talent and greatness as some other players do, but they're able nonetheless to maintain a certain level for a prolonged period of time, more than even more talented players can. And that's my general notion of what Louis Sockalexis' game was like. And he did not last very long. And by all accounts, contemporary accounts, he had a problem with drink, and that ultimately did him in. Now, the accounts of him that we do have, the contemporary accounts of interviews, of coverage of him, demonstrate a couple things. One is that certainly, by all we have to go by, he was a gentleman. And that he was someone who suffered at the hands of racism and intolerance and ignorance and oppression every day. And a lot, very similar to African American players who at that point had already been banned. We're talking the 1890s. The African American players in the major leagues had been banned through a wink sort of agreement for around a decade at that point. Something similar to what they experienced, in which you had some people who didn't necessarily have a problem. No doubt thought it was novel. You're talking about people who are a minority, and the centerpiece of much derision throughout the country. But people who weren't necessarily suffering at the hands of all the fan base, but who definitely were suffering for a lot of it. And the Cleveland Indians have just made news, like the Washington Football Club, that maybe they're not going to use the term Indians because it's derogatory, right? Well, not any more derogatory than calling the Boston basketball club the Celtics. Is it any more derogatory than the University of Southern California Trojans or the Michigan State Spartans? Now, fine, I got you. The Trojans and the Spartans are no longer a contemporary people per se. We're talking about ancient Sparta. We're talking about ancient Troy in what is today Turkey. Now, I don't know if the Greeks and the Turks would agree with that assessment. Like the Italians, we're talking about a people whose culture, even in recorded history, goes back millennia, let alone non-recorded history. So I don't know that they would totally feel disassociated with Spartans and Trojans. But fine, let's keep it about Native Americans, the Fighting Illini, right, in Illinois. They referred to their college symbol as a symbol and not a mascot. I remember Roger Ebert, who went to that school, telling the story how his father said to him as a teenager, that is a symbol that stands for something. No, that's not a mascot. Now, the symbol is a Native American. So they clearly have a reverence, a respect, an admiration for the Native American. The Atlanta Braves, how can anyone, any people referred to as brave, construe that as a demeaning term? There was a AAA baseball team known as the Chiefs, and their symbol was sort of a silhouetted symbol of a Native American chief. Well, how is that different than the Generals? There are athletic teams called the Generals. A chief is a rank, right? These names, these symbols, these team names, is it truly impossible to regard them as anything other than derogatory? Yeah, now you call a team the Redskins. I don't see how you see that as anything other than derogatory. Although now that I think about it, I remember seeing a motion picture at Film Forum from the 30s called, was it The Mask of Fu Manchu? And it was about a Chinese guy named Fu Manchu. The audience, my fellow liberal New York audience, laughed in disgust every time someone on screen referred to as Chinese folks as yellow, the yellow man, the yellow people, but didn't bat an eyelash whenever someone on screen referred to Westerners as the white man or white people. So that's just inconsistent. If I was in the Philippines one summer a good while ago, and in the Philippines they refer to all Westerners as Joe. And everywhere I went, whether it was a small town, whether it was Manila, any room I entered, any block I walked on, everyone got whiplash, looking at me and staring. I was treated like a wonderful guest by so many people in their homes. Just wonderful hospitality of spirit, of life, of brotherhood. That was maybe half the people, and the other half looked at me as if the circus was in town, for no other reason than clearly the color of my skin. Now, I can't assume to know the degree of their looking at me like a freak. Some of them definitely looked at me like a freak. Now, is it impossible to imagine, and I played in a basketball tournament when I was there, is it impossible to imagine that the wonderful people, the tonnage of wonderful people that treated me like a brother, might not sometime put together a team and maybe call them the pale faces or the white skins? Is it impossible to think that that could happen and that it's not meant to be derogatory? I'm certainly willing to think that that's possible. Is it also possible that the other half of the people who went out of their way to make me feel alienated because of the color of my skin would also put a team together and possibly call it the Palefaces or the Whiteskins with malicious and derogatory intent. That also is possible. We need to have conversation. And yeah, I don't know that I would give the Washington Football Club the benefit of the doubt for calling their team the Redskins. I sure believe that conversation is in order. And likewise, Chief Wahoo, and that's obviously a caricature that looks stupid and would definitely raise an eyebrow to, I would think, to even a person allowing the team all the slack in the world would raise an eyebrow. What is this symbol supposed to mean? Now, I don't even mean to be a devil's advocate. And I definitely do not mean to defend any establishment that actually was derogatory, had derogatory intentions. And I wouldn't necessarily be inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. But obviously, it is theoretically possible that being derogatory was not an intent, and that it doesn't have to be seen as derogatory. And that in reality, not just theoretically, but in reality, let's find out. Let's figure this out. If you have teams called the Generals, is a team called the Chiefs necessarily derogatory? If you have a team called the Celtics, is a team called the Indians necessarily derogatory? If you have a team whose fan base clearly has a reverence and admiration and respect for its self-identity, its self-identification with Native Americans as a symbol of meaning and integrity, is that necessarily derogatory? Someone like Louis Sockalexis or the African Americans before him, there being no doubt that they suffered cruelly at the hands of racism every day. There being no doubt about that, the question arises. You ask the fans to name your team, and they named them the Indians 25 years after he played for them. And so the honest question is, was that something at the time that the fan base did as a demeaning joke, which of course we wouldn't put it past them, but are you going to do that towards your own team? And maybe I too am someone in the 21st century struggling to wrap my brain around the psychology of a fan base that would choose that. Or were they simply doing it in reverence of a famous and popular player who was a Native American? And that may have been the case 25 years after he played. Is that impossible, regardless of the fact that when he did play 25 years prior, he suffered demeaning indignity and racism? That's, I think, a fair question. Of course, I really wish that we could know how Louis Sockalexis would feel today about that. Would he be here saying, assholes, scumbags, before whom I set foot on that field every day with my shoulders back and chin held high? They had the audacity to name the team after me and after my people Would he say they can go to hell? Or would he say, wow, we've come a ways? Would he be honored that a fan base whose grandparents derided him through racism are now choosing to name the team after him? Would he feel that he's suffering disrespect beyond his time on earth, in which he suffered enough? Or would he acknowledge, or would he believe that this was respect? Now that we're never going to know. When you call this team the Indians, what on your part is going into that? Not to belittle what the Native American sentiment is. I assume we're at least at the point where we're acknowledging the importance of that, of what they feel. But even more than that, Native Americans, who themselves refer to themselves as Indians, are simply not Indians.
Right.
The reason why they were called Indians is because Columbus felt that he had landed in India. Look, if you're a Native American, you're just not an Indian. But Native Americans call themselves Indians. So we as human beings, whether you're on the right or the left, are running around in circles. So the right wing destroys truth through their abuse of power. The left wing is increasingly destroying truth by their bullying of political correctness through popular culture, so that whether you're right or left, you are becoming the embodiment of that hilarious moment in The Office when Michael Scott is asking Oscar, is there anything you prefer to be called that's less derogatory than Mexican?
Oh, this is less offensive.
Mexican is not a derogatory term.
Exactly.
Now that's a joke, I imagine, that a left-leaning Hollywood writer wrote against right-wing sensibilities. But the left wing is helping to close the circle on that being a reality. Frankly, a lazy left-winger would look at everything I've said and suggested with intolerance and label me as someone who's not with the program. But all I've said and done has been an instigation for conversation with an eye on that which may be derogatory. What do you mean by that? But I'm sincere when I ask, what do you mean by that? And it's important for us to know. It's important for us to listen to the feelings of an ethnic group. It's important for us to listen to the intentions of the group in power. It's important for both to listen to each other and come up and arrive at something called understanding. And maybe the fan base does say, well, you know, I think maybe we did mean something a little derogatory in there. Or maybe it's for the aggrieved party to come to an understanding that they really don't have derogatory intentions. And we don't necessarily have to see it as derogatory. I'm not suggesting that I know. What I'm trying to promote is actual conversation, actual mutual respect, the actual possibility for enlightenment and understanding, so that whatever changes we make are for right reasons and are on the side of sincerity and truth.